All right, I'll be sharing my slide any moment to come up now. All right, I believe we all can see my slide. If you can see my slide, um, just send an emoji, maybe a waving emoji, so that I'll be sure that we're on the same page. If you can see my slide. Oh, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Dr. Rebecca. Okay, that means everyone can actually see me. So today we'll be looking at, um, yes, today we'll be looking at developing an effective statement of the problem and choosing appropriate research technique. All right. Now, by the end of this particular seminar, we should be able to have everyone understanding how to effectively coin a good statement of the problem and to be able to identify an appropriate research method to use for their own analysis. Sorry, someone wants to come in. Let me see if I can admit the person quickly. Uh, okay, let me see. All right, so let's go back to the slide. Okay, so and the idea is for one to be able to coin an effective statement of problem that will guide every research. We know that the essence of every research is to identify a problem and, of course, generate a particular method that problem could be used to tackle and address that particular problem effectively, right? So the presentation outline will go this way: the meaning of research problem statement, how to draft effective research, how to draft effective problem statement, the meaning of research technique, and choosing an effective research technique. So let us dive into the topic of today, which is how to coin an effective statement of problem. The most important thing is this: what is the meaning of statement of problem? If we really want to address this particular issue, and we say that statement of problem has to do with a particular issue that an individual has been able to identify, and of course, identifying the gap that needed to be filled at the end of the particular research an individual is trying to carry out. And entirely, this particular statement of problem guides the entire research focus, and creating a central attention on the problem at hand, of which one an individual tries to investigate. And if you are carrying out an investigative study where a dependent and independent variable is captured in your topic, you should realize the fact that your statement of problem should center on the dependent variable, which is usually the outcome variable of your study. Now, statement of problem normally consists of three major parts, right? There are many other parts, of course, we shall be looking at in this presentation, but the three major parts that statement of problem contains are: the number one here is called the ideal situation. The second is the reality on ground and the consequences of that particular reality on ground. So there are many other vital components that statement of problem normally have. Of course, we shall be looking at that shortly. But these three vital components must be in your statement of the problem. Let us dive in straight. Let's start with the first one, which is description of the ideal scenario or ideal situation on ground. But we're looking at it from a particular topic that I've coined out here, which is the impact of financial inclusion on manufacturing sector growth in Nigeria. So this particular topic will guide us on how an effective statement of problem should be coined. Remember, I mentioned that if you are carrying out an investigative study, your statement of problem usually centers on the dependent variable. And of course, you know that investigative study has to do with study where we have a clear independent variable and a dependent variable. The dependent variable is the outcome variable, while the independent variable is what influences the dependent variable, as the case may be. So looking at this topic here, the dependent variable here is manufacturing sector growth, while the independent variable in this particular topic is the financial inclusion. So meaning that we shall be looking out for a problem around this topic, centering on the manufacturing sector growth. Now, we need to describe the ideal scenario of which we expect the manufacturing sector to be. We all should be on the same page for the fact that, okay, manufacturing sector should be an important engine of growth and an antidote for unemployment that creates wealth, right? This is a sector that we expect to perform these particular functions. Okay, just give me a minute. Let me admit someone. I think I will have someone knocking. I hope my slide is moving. If my slide is moving, can you wave your hand? Okay, great. Okay, so this is the ideal scenario that we expect the manufacturing sector to perform, right? Remember, we said a statement of problem contains three major vital components. The first one is to describe the ideal scenario. So we expect manufacturing sector to be an engine of growth, an antidote for unemployment, and a creator of wealth. Now, the second statement is, what is the reality on ground that made us want to go into this particular research, right? Now, in the second statement here, we'll look at the reality on ground, or trying to look at the reality of the situation on ground. Here, we describe the condition that prevents the goal or state of value discussed in statement one from being achieved at this present time. In this statement, Toby, please, can you mute yourself? Toby, if you can hear me, can you mute yourself, please? Great, right? So we describe this situation on ground. What is the reality on ground? We've already known the ideal situation, which is manufacturing sector are supposed to be this and this and that. Now, what is the reality that made us want to go into that particular research, right? And of course, we have to connect that reality on ground using certain statements such as, however, unfortunately, or in spite of. Okay? Now, for an example, we could say that the manufacturing sectors are not growing or performing as expected as its output continue to decline. The level of employment in this sector continues to drop, and capacity utilization is also declining. So this is the reality on ground. But the ideal situation is that we expect them to do all of those we mentioned in statement one, but this is the reality on ground that we found ourselves that made us want to go into this particular research. Then statement three is, we need to identify efforts that have been made previously to address the reality on ground, right? We have to state the measures that have been put in place, either as policymakers or organizations or whatever individual that's carrying out that is, or whatever agent or whatever sector that's having out that particular issue. What have they been able to do previously to tackle this problem? We can use statement like this. In light of the above, policymakers have employed several strategies such as tax incentives, subsidies, etc., which were aimed at enhancing the performance of the manufacturing sector in order to bring about economic growth, employment creation, and wealth creation, which we expect the manufacturing sector to actually be. All right. Now, these are the measures that have been put on ground to tackle the problem we saw on ground. Right. Now, the next statement will now be, how come the problem still persists? We state the persistence of the problem. We can say that despite these strategies, the manufacturing sector hasn't performed any better. Instead, its performance is still on the decline. We can add some statistical figures to back up our claims, right, from various sources. Those numerical numbers helps to strengthen the conviction that yes, they are still not performing, and the figures are there to explain the situation. So you don't just mention the fact that these are the policies that have been put on ground and yet the problem persists. We need to put in some, we need to capture some facts, available facts and figures that will back up whatever statement we have made earlier on, which of course should be captured under the statement 4. Remember, the statement of problem is like an essay that must be written in a flow format. But I'm just bringing out the ingredients that must be captured in that particular essay. The statement 5 is to state the consequences of the problem. The problem we identified, the effort that have been made to tackle that problem, yet the problem persists. So what are the consequences of not tackling those problems? Now, a statement can go like this. Remember, we are dealing with the manufacturing sector as an example in this statement here. The manufacturing sector can't expand its branches of operation, can't expand its output, and the effect on the economy may include they can't be able to create jobs because of that, they can't be able to create wealth, and their ability to contribute to growth is not also there. So these are the consequences of the problems that we found out that the manufacturing sector is facing. Then the statement 6, we state the reasons for your research. So here, you will now bring out your motivation that wants to make you go into this particular research. Given the fact that manufacturing sectors are well-known catalysts for real sector growth and development of any nation, its underperformance clearly portends a great danger for the economy in general, right? So this is the motivation for your research. Please just give me a sec. Let me admit someone. I think we have someone that wants to join us again. All right. So these are some of the, like, the motivation that wants to now make you go into this particular research, that given these problems identified, and if it continues to happen, these are the dangers that will come out of it. Okay. Now, it's also important to note that statement of problem also captures a research gap that you also intend to fill in the course of your research. Let me admit someone else. Right. So in this case here, one aspect of or your statement of problem will capture the ideal situation on ground, the what the reality of, I mean, the ideal situation we expect it to be, the reality on ground, effort that have been made previously, right? The consequences of not addressing those problems and the motivation for going into that. Then a gap. Most times, people in the management sciences normally capture only their research gap as a statement of problem, but we in social sciences we go beyond that. Now, in this case, you could mention the fact that okay, several studies have been done in so and so area with respect to manufacturing sector performance. However, this particular gap still remains that the study intends to fill. It is very possible that many studies may not have looked at it from the angle of how financial inclusion impacts on manufacturing sector growth and whatever it is that they may have captured earlier on. But it should be significantly different for what you are trying to tackle. Otherwise, you'll be repeating what other people have indeed previously done, which is, at variance to what you're trying to do. So in this case, you capture a gap, just very brief gap, right? So that it will not look like an empirical gap that you still capture after empirical review, but just to identify a small caveat to something different that you are trying to do that other people have not did, have actually done. Then, of course, you conclude your what is it called, your statement of problem by saying, okay, the motivation for the study in this case is to propose means of trying to improve the private sector, I mean the manufacturing sector performance. And in this case here, you restate more or less like the topic of your study. It is of interest in this study to conduct analysis on how to solve the approved problems, or it's of interest in this study to, to figure out the impact of financial inclusion on manufacturing sector growth. Now, there are two dangers to avoid. Very important when stating your problem in your research. All right. Number one is to realize the fact that if you are carrying out an investigative study has to do a study that will have a dependent and an independent variable, right? And the independent variable in this case happens to be having an impact on the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the outcome variable, as the case may be. Your statement of problem should dwell more on your outcome variable, which is your what? Your dependent variable. Just a minute, let me admit someone else. Okay. Now, and it's important for you to also realize the fact that you don't connect your independent variable to your dependent variable when stating your problem. Otherwise, you've concluded on research and nothing to be done. It's just like saying that part of the reason why the manufacturing sectors are not performing today at the point we expect them is because of financial inclusion, lack of funds, lack of all of the rest. I mean, that should be the final outcome of your research. So when discussing your statement of problem, your independent variable should be technically silenced. And that's why most times we'll let our students know that writing research is a skill, right? It's an organizational skill that one has to learn, even beyond classrooms. And of course, most times you learn these things by attending conferences, by attending workshops, and by attending seminars such as this, right? So connecting the statement of problem, connecting both variables, as the independent and the dependent variable, seems to be the conclusion of research, and of course, nothing to be done at that case. All right. So this is it about statements of the problem. We need to identify the ideal situation on ground of what we expect a particular a particular event to be, right? What is the reality on ground? What effort has been made? What are the consequences of the problems, right? And what efforts have been made to address it, yet it still persists, that made you want to go into it? And what are the gaps you found out in other studies that you want to fill in your own study? Then avoid connecting both the dependent and the independent variable in this case, right? So that is it for our statement of the problem. I don't know if anyone has any question to ask before we move to the next leg of this presentation. If anyone have any question to ask, please feel free. You can unmute yourself and ask a question if you have any.
Hello.
Yes, please introduce yourself while asking your questions so that we'll be responding. Okay?
Well well done, the doctor, Professor.
Okay. You're welcome, ma. Yes, I can hear you clearly, ma. Go ahead.
I'm great. Presentation. Thank you for the insight.
Yes, ma. You're welcome, ma.
You stated in the process of presenting that
Your network is
there is need for data, empirical data per se, to strengthen.
I am actually struggling to connect your question. Why?
The
Because the network is
problem. But from my own understanding,
yes.
people that from the works I've read in time past, I noticed that people usually cite empirical works.
The network is
My network bad, or is it my voice?
no. The network is breaking. It tends to break. Maybe
People usually cite
yes,
empirical works, works done
like a research gap, so to
by
say.
authors, some scholars like that.
Yes.
But
Man, we're actually struggling to hear
I
you.
think the my
Yes.
own understanding and what I learned that it's not. Are you? Can you people
Please, can you type your
hear?
question out? Is it possible for you to type it out?
Your voice, your voice is breaking.
It's breaking. We can
Your
beg.
voice is breaking.
Can you type it out? If you can type it out, then I can read it out once I see it. All right. So
Sorry, Professor Eze.
yes, Prof.
Professor Eze, can you please finish your presentation before you give time for questions?
All right.
Round up your presentation and then let's work on the questions. Otherwise, you will not be able to complete your presentation. Please go ahead with your presentation
All right. Brilliant.
and conclude. Then we can ask questions.
Questions afterwards. Okay. So please, if you have any question to ask, kindly type it in the chat box. Then we'll give opportunity to raise the question. If it's not very clear, then we can fall back to your questions on the chat box. So we'll proceed with the second leg of this presentation, which is choosing appropriate research technique, right? And please, if you can see my slide, can you just wave again or give a thumbs up if the slides are moving? Oh, brilliant, brilliant. Now, the second leg of our presentation today is, yes, great, great. It's about choosing appropriate research technique. Now, the question is this: what is research technique? Research technique refers to the specific method or tool used to collect, analyze, and interpret data in any research. So, whatever method you want to use to analyze your data set that must have been collected either from secondary data, that is documented data, or from the field, which has to do with primary data and all of the rest. So, the method of which you are to use to analyze such data, we call it research technique. Okay, and the essence is to ensure that research are reliable, valid, and they can be replicable in other research findings. And of course, it helps researchers to draw meaningful conclusions and make informed decisions based on evidence. Now, very important, when choosing your research technique, there are three useful and basic questions that need to be answered, right? So meaning that the nature of the research technique you can adopt has to do with the nature of the question you have raised in your research. So there's the possibility of one having 4 research questions and using 4 different research techniques for all of them. It's not possible, it's not compulsory rather that your 4 or 5 or 10 research questions must be answered using one particular sweeping research technique, right? Depending on the nature of the research question you must have asked at a particular point in time determines the method of analysis to be used. Now, what are those very important 3 useful questions? Number 1 is, what is the type of research question did the study formulate or raised? Right? What are the type and number of variables does the study want to analyze? Then what nature and characteristics of variable does the study have? So if your research question can be able to address any of these 3, then we can now be able to know, okay, which particular method are you to use? So we'll start with the first one, which is, what type of research question did your study formulate? Now, the first step here is, what question type does the study want to answer? Now, in this case here, we'll have different kind of research questions. The first on the list is what we call descriptive research question. In this case, you are merely describing your subject or data and their characteristics in a relatively simple way without exploring any cause and effect relationship or making any predictions. So if your research question has to be descriptive in nature, what are the examples of such kind of research question? Right? Number 1 is, what are the major challenges faced by women entrepreneurs in rural communities? Another is, what are the most common sources of funding used by small and medium scale SMEs in Nigeria? So this is just a descriptive research question. And if you look at this descriptive research question here, it does not have a clear dependent and independent variable. It's just like you are describing, you are just raising a question that is descriptive in nature, just describing, right? It's not an investigative kind of question. And in this case, the method of analysis one can actually adopt frequency distribution, central tendencies such as mean, standard deviation, percentages, etc. So in this case, there's no in-depth analysis to be carried out. You just carry out frequency distribution using frequency table, central tendencies such as getting the means, the averages, the standard deviation, percentages, etc. Look at the example of the research question there. Now, the second kind of research question has to do with correlational or predictive cause and effect research question. Here we have group variables we are trying to develop relationship between, or group of variables we are trying to use to predict one another. Now, an example of correlation or predictive research question is this. What is the effect of inflation rates on consumer purchasing power in Nigeria? Or how does social media usage influence academic performance among Bingham University students? So you could see that in this kind of research question here, we have 2 variables clearly specified, the dependent and independent variable. And if you look at the first research question here, the independent variable is inflation rate and the dependent variable is consumer purchasing power. Now, in addressing this kind of research question, it has its own unique research techniques. And the method that addresses this kind of research question include correlation or predictive analysis, such as correlation regression, that's linear or panel regression, or path analysis, such as SEM. So if you have a predictive research question, such as what we have here on the screen, that has a clear dependent and independent variable that looks investigative in nature, these are some of the techniques that one can actually adopt in tackling such kind of research question: correlation, regression, linear or panel, path analysis, etc. Now, the third kind of research question, right, that one may likely have amongst the research question that any researcher may have raised is what we call group differences research questions. Here we are trying to compare groups to one another to find out if there are statistically significant differences between them and one or more outcomes. For example, an example of such kind of group differences research question is this. In what ways does academic performance differ between male and female students in Nigerian universities? Or how does access to healthcare services vary between rural and urban dwellers in Nasarawa State? right? So in this case, when you have a group differences research question, that means you have a particular group and another group. You are trying to carry out research to know if there's any significant differences among these groups. It could be 2 groups, it could be 3 groups, it could be 4 groups. Then the method of analysis that best tackles it is what we call the t-test, the one-way ANOVA or factorial ANOVA or MANOVA, right? And most of these kind of studies are usually for primary data kind of research work, right? For the t-statistics, well, for the t-test is usually used when you have just 2 groups. But when you have more than 2 groups, you'll be looking at methods such as ANOVA or factorial ANOVA or MANOVA, where you have multiple groups at the same time. And these are the kind of research questions that tackles, these are the kind of research technique that tackles this kind of research questions, as the case may be. Now, the second item we pointed out earlier on is to identify and define your variables. Very important. You need to be able to specify what is your dependent and independent variable, identify the number of variables in each research question, then provide proxies for each variable. In this case, clearly defining each of your variables. So there are some research questions that have multiple variables in them, right? So there's the need for you to identify, okay, amongst your research question, do we have a dependent variable? Do we have independent variable? And if we do have independent variable, how many independent variables are in each of the research question, and what are the proxies that one can actually use? And remember, it is the proxies of your variables that are expected to appear in each of your research questions, as the case may be. Just a minute, let me admit someone else. I have someone knocking at the door. Do you have anyone? Okay, so the second step is to identify and define your nature of your variables. In this case, what is your dependent variable? What is your independent variable? Or what are independent variables and what is your dependent variable? Identify the number of variables in each research question, and what are the proxies that you want to use to address each research question. Then the third item on the list here is, what is the level of measurement for each variable? All right. Remember, I have 3 basic kinds of measurement for variables. What we call the nominal measurement, also known as the categorical measurement. They will have the ordinal measurement. They will have the interval or ratio measurement, also known as numeric or continuous scale. Now, if the variable you are using is nominal or categorical, right, then in this case, you now have to look at things that has to do with, okay, are the groups equal or balanced? Are some categories empty? And if your variables are interval or ratio, they need to address the issue of normality. So in this case, we are trying to make the fact known that if you are using categorical variables, right, which is also known as nominal variables, such as gender, nominal variables are such as gender, religion, tribes. These are categorical variables, meaning that if you are in this group, you cannot be in another group. You cannot be a male at the same time still be a female. So those kind of groups are known as nominal groups or categorical variables, as the case may be. So in this case, do we have a balanced Do we have a balanced groups for male and for females and all of the rest? But for for interval or ratio measurement, right? Are your data normally distributed or not? Meaning that the responses generated from the data for your variables, are they relatively balanced in terms of answers? Do we have outliers amongst your data set? Then of course, for ordinal measurement, you are looking at things that has to do with maybe strongly agree, disagree, and all of the rest. That's responses that are usually ranked, as the case may be. So now, addressing this nature and characteristics of variable enables you to know which method are you supposed to use at a particular point in time. If your data sets are normally distributed, right? That is, if your interval or ratio variables or data are normally distributed, then the issue of parametric and non-parametric has to also come into play. If your variables are normally distributed, then you must adopt what we call the parametric methods. However, if your variables are not normally distributed, then in this case, you fall back to what we call the non-parametric methods. All right. So these are some of the questions that you need to answer before choosing any particular research technique of your choice. And of course, I may need to also mention here that when we talk about parametric methods, we are talking about methods such as t-test, ANOVA, regression analysis, that's linear regression analysis, MANOVA, etc. Then when we talk about the non-parametric methods, we are looking at things like ordinal logistic regression, that's the alternative or linear regression, right? Or the what we call the binary logistic regression, which is also the non-parametric or linear regression. Then we have things like chi-square, right? We have things, chi-square is for non-parametric, of course. Then we have other aspects such as Mann-Whitney U-test and all of the rest. So if your data sets are normally distributed, you use the parametric methods. And usually the parametric methods they have stronger statistical power. If they are not normally distributed, you fall back to what we call the non-parametric method. So these are basically the 3 key items to capture, essentially when dealing with the nature of research techniques you must adopt. Let me go back and do a brief recap around it. Remember, we said that the first thing you need to do is to identify the, what is it called? The type of research question raised. Is it correlational research question? Is it descriptive? Or is it group differences? Then what are the types and number of variables in each? And the third one is, what is the nature and characteristics of your variables that you intend to study in your research question? If you can be able to answer these 3 questions clearly in your research question, then you should be able to know the appropriate research technique to eventually use. And of course, I gave examples of each of the research techniques you must adopt depending on the nature of the research question you may have raised. Okay, so at this point, I've been able to clearly capture the statement of problem and also deal with choosing appropriate research technique, essentially. I'm going to share this slide, of course, to everyone after this presentation. All right, so we'll give room for question and answers, which will last for about 10 minutes. Then before we call it a night, so that we don't keep actually everyone waiting at this point. All right, so we'll take questions from everyone that have any question to ask at this point. Okay, if you have any question, kindly unmute yourself and raise your question, or you can type it in the chat box. Of course, I'll be able to receive it. Okay, question and answer time.